So we'd like to introduce Matthew Holt, who, as we said, is president of Smack Health. Matthew's going to be walking us through a discussion on really the trends within health tech, what's coming, what's hot, what's not, what's needed, and actually isn't even there today. So with no further ado, Matthew, I'm going to hand over to you, and we're looking forward to a rigorous discussion.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jeff. That was really fascinating. I'm, as you can tell, in the glamorous, I'll give you guys a shot here. I'm in the glamorous New Orleans Convention Center, somewhere down there. And I'm having a bit of an Accenture day because Tom was at Accenture, Brian is at Accenture, and in about half an hour I'm on a panel with Carve Sabafi, who Brian, you both guys know very well. So I'm maybe over Accenture today. So real quick, I, like Brian and Tom and Jeff for a while, have been in this space of looking at kind of new technologies, new companies to change health technology. It's now called digital health because nobody can come up with a better term. It isn't really that. I'm at the American Telemedicine Association, which really should be called the Telehealth Association, and really we're all sitting here saying, hang on, what the hell is telehealth? It's just, you know, more technology to do healthcare, and perhaps what digital health is. Having said that, what I do want to dive into with Brian and Thomas is, and with all of you asking Q&A, is that there are lots of different segments of activity. So we're not going to show slides. We're just going to have a chat here, and we'd love your questions, comments, answers, etc. There are lots of different segments. There's obviously one big thing going on, which is that we're seeing a huge amount of venture capital activity and a lot of money around. It's not all going into, you know, late stage contributions to Uber and others. There has been, depending on who you believe globally, somewhere in the region of about $7 to $12 billion in venture capital a year going into what's loosely called digital health. That might include consumer genomics, people like 23andMe that were mentioned earlier, but also includes tools designed for hospitals and doctors, and then this whole new group of tools and services aimed at patients. Obviously, Newtopia is one of the companies in that space. And how you define a patient and how far they are along the spectrum from being, like me, out in New Orleans, probably drinking and eating too much last night, and on the way to getting diabetes, versus somebody who is, you know, 80 years old and has already got several chronic conditions and is maybe spending all the time in the hospital and frequent flyer. That is all being chunked out and sorted out at the moment, not only by entrepreneurs in the technology sector, but also by the policymakers and the players in traditional healthcare system. So I want to start really globally with Brian and Tom. You guys look at this across the board. How do you think about this distinction between sort of technology-driven tools for patients as a whole versus what the traditional healthcare system has done and is now steadily adopting? So that's a pretty wide question. Just, you know, I'd love your general comments on how you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, to start off with that, I would describe, maybe to your point, I'll introduce a new concept that I think you'll like, Matthew, is I think we are starting, over the next 3 to 5 years, we are kind of moving into what we'll describe as a post-digital world on that, where this isn't about, is it a digital health solution? This is about how do we provide solutions that are personalized and tailored to individuals and reach them where they are. And the technology just becomes the behind the scenes enabler of that. In terms of where that's at, we're at early stages in the healthcare system of thinking in that way. So in healthcare, we're still, I'd say, in the digital world, trying to figure out how do we apply technology to have relevance and personalization on a more proactive basis. With that, I'd say we're starting to introduce the concept of more personalization and more outreach, so we can reach people both at home and on the go in more meaningful ways versus, you know, needing to always be in a physical setting. And a lot of those new care models that blend physical plus digital as services are starting to emerge, as well as connect with those things that don't need an in-person setting and can be delivered with better labor productivity in a virtual way.
Thomas? You might be on mute, Tom. No, I think you're on mute, Tom.
I'm unmuted.
There you go.
Now I'm unmuted.
There we go.
Oh, thank you. Well, to come at it a little bit from the way that you've teed it up and think about it the way the employer thinks about it, I think there's some amount of frustration because that separation does exist. I mean, there's all this that gets done within what we call the health system, and then there are these ancillary innovations that are coming to the fore that hold a lot of promise, but are happening disconnected from the health system. And I think one of the things that employers are looking for and maybe even forcing to occur is bringing these together. Now, obviously, there's a life cycle of building evidence and obtaining coverage, and can you charge for this through a code and things like that. But I think that one of the things that we see is that employers want to see a more integrated, holistic solution for their employees, and I think you're going to have as an expectation. The one area that I would say you'll still see one-off carved-out solutions are where there are access issues. So example would be behavioral health. I mean, we see, in fact, you mentioned the money flowing into venture. We track that on a monthly and quarterly basis, and digital health is still one of the fastest growing areas is in behavioral health. And, a lot of what's driving that is access issues in behavioral health. So I think there will be areas like that where you'll see these disconnected one-off solutions still being popular. But by and large, I think that we're going to see an expectation from employers that there's a lot more workflow, administrative, and experiential integration.
Yeah, I think that's
I think I would add to that. Yeah, just to add, I would say some of that comes from the voice of the employee, which also can drive the voice of the employer. And it ties back to some prior points of just, well, what do people want? And increasingly, people are looking for both simplicity, convenience, and personalization. So even many solutions that we've seen enter that have come as point solutions have been better than stuff in the past, but still are not as tailored as they could be to the market of one. And we're getting to a point where technology, regulatory landscape, and people's behaviors are kind of allowing that to start to happen. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. Just on the sort of almost joking, I've run into very recently, actually one here at this conference and one last week, 2 mental health apps which are designed to help the mental health of early stage startup founders, because they are the most distressed people in America, of course. Anyway, so let's dig into that point a little bit. I still want to dig in a bit more to this point about the sort of the difference between the if you like, technology startup service world and the traditional healthcare system. So a little while ago, Indu Samara and I, my colleague at Health 2.0, put together a talk, which is now called written up. It's called Flipping the Stack. So I just want to describe that, and I want the two of you to tell me how wrong we are. So what we basically said is that originally we delivered healthcare in place, in person, between a doctor and a patient in a hospital. People went to a place, and it was an event-driven activity. Over time, we realized we had to do better, and we started adding services around that. And you can think of the first degrees of prevention and wellness, but also nurse advice lines and at-home care and what have you, services that sort of surround that event, but usually driven off that event. And then eventually we started putting in technology, and those of us in the healthcare business have now seen $30-odd billion of government funding go in to put in electronic medical records and elsewhere. And then we have a layer over the top now, which is technology tracking all of that activity. Now, you can argue that with the rise of a bunch of non-health technology, and I'm talking here about players like Amazon and Apple and Google and all their friends, who have not only who are building new technology based on things like voice. We'll have Alexas in our home now, and obviously Siri and Google and all that kind of stuff. But also all the other devices which are now getting sensor devices which are getting cheap and easy. We're starting to put those in the bathroom. We just had an example of the rapid declining cost of genetic testing. Other diagnostic testing is getting cheaper and easier. We're starting to see experimental tools that you breathe into or that you pee on or spit on or whatever that start tracking very quickly. We have weight scales that are in the house, and I just had my blood pressure taken downstairs if it's a bit high. Overdid it last night, perhaps. So you're building a technology infrastructure. the argument that Indu and I have been making is that eventually, what you want to do with people who have chronic illness, and I will get this back to the world of prevention in a minute. But for people who have chronic illness, who are responsible for most of the costs, what you want to do is put in place a technology infrastructure that is essentially at the base, measuring them at the bottom rather than being the last thing at the top of the track, what happened in the traditional healthcare system. And that tech infrastructure has a lot of different components. Obviously, it's growing in size as more and more stuff gets wrapped into technology. But it's basically always on, always monitoring, always managing, and always messaging to whoever needs to flow. And then on top of that, you start adding services. There are numbers of companies which are starting to add nurse advice lines and coaching and what have you. And then on top of that, you're actually getting to going into the healthcare system for care delivery, whether it be seeing a patient. So it's like care delivery is done by exception rather than the other way around. Now, that's clearly not where we are now. But I'd argue that you'll start with the more chronically ill, and there are people you're not going to get to in the employer world, but there are many people who are employees, in the sub-Medicare population who have diabetes, have asthma, have heart problems that that require that kind of attention, and that eventually we're going to be building systems around that type of technology, and the getting to the traditional healthcare system is going to kind of be the last resort. Now, I'm not the first person to talk about this. There clearly have been people with this kind of vision before. You could argue that Kaiser started this way back in the 30s. But how realistic is the model I've just described, you guys believe, to be how we're going to start dealing with chronic illness in terms of in-home monitoring, all those services on top, and flipping that stack over the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
Brian, you first.
Oh, see, so
that was dumb. I like it.
No, I think the key question there and how you framed it too is time horizon. Like you mentioned, 5 to 10 years. We're kind of on the start of that evolution. To your point of these ideas have been discussed before, I think we are at a unique point where some of those ideas are starting to be put into action and practice, starting often with chronic disease, as you mentioned, just because there's a path to how you can fund it. But the unique point of both regulatory frameworks changing, which are allowing for more technology use and location independent care being provided and reimbursed for. So that's one. Two, the concept of technology prices getting better, more consumer grade, and prices falling. Consumer attitudes getting used to using and purchasing services in that way, as well as just the overall, continuing cost of care all kind of coming together at one. That's kind of driving that change. I will state, you're also seeing maybe then it just starting with chronic disease and working its way down. It might actually come as a sandwich and come from the top, chronic disease, as well as the masses up. And you're starting to see that now if you go with, well, we're seeing direct to consumer subscription services that are healthcare related starting to get traction. So if you look at things like His or Hims and Hers, Roman, you named those services starting to come up on the subscription side. You even have subscription-based primary care from things like 98.6 and K-Health. So that's happening there. Then you see from the other side, you're seeing new care models that leverage technology and are more location independent, coming from care models like City Block, Iora, et cetera. So those are both converging. The real question is, well, when will they all flip and come together? 5 years, 10 years? I don't know if we'll all know, but I do see the progression is starting to happen. What do you think, Tom?
I completely agree. And, I think if you think, what are the limiting factors to allow that to happen? Because, the way you laid it out is, undeniably an end state kind of a view that we're advancing. And some of this might be the weight companies like Amazon and Apple have to kind of push the envelope. But I think the regulatory framework is definitely one thing that's a limiting factor. You do see CMS being creative, opening up new codes, really emphasizing more on digital innovation and how they're thinking about making sure these things come through the pipeline faster. But maybe the one other lens, once again, coming back to the way the employer sees this, is how this all gets packaged and distributed as a health product. I mean, right now, there's no reason why all the digital technologies and innovation that we're talking about can't be distributed through the doctor, through the physician. But the system isn't set up that way. And right now, large employers are going their own way oftentimes. They're the ones that are driving some innovation here. And I like that, you know. They're saying we've got these employees and we're going to give them the best care we can. And we got to cobble this together and package this up and distribute it on our own. And they're doing it on their own. So I do think a lot of the innovation is being distributed by the large employer community. And I think that's just, once again, a symptom of one of these limiting factors, just getting this stuff packaged up and distributed in a way that that pulls through as much as possible current reimbursement and insurance products. And I see that as a major limiting factor right now. And you know, we've got to get over that. And right now you see large employers being most successful in doing that on their own.
Yeah, I'd add that, you know, look, if we were to design a proper healthcare financing system, it probably wouldn't have been designed based on 1940s tax codes and 1930s insurance models, but that's what we got, right? And absent, you know, Bernie Sanders winning and 60 vote Senate majority, it's likely to be that way for a while. Who knows? I won't predict the political future. I tried to do that in 2016, and I've been looking stupid ever since. But you know, you do have this undeniable sort of issue there, which is that most of the costs of chronic disease, the majority of them, tend to be in an older post-employee population. We don't, with the, you know, there's some growth in Medicare Advantage using some of this stuff, but most of the people who've been most active, in a place where many tech companies, health tech companies have gone to sell their wares, has been the employer market. And the employers, like our folks on the phone on the conference here today, have got somewhat different interests, right? So there's a lot of interest in things like maternity, a lot of interest in mental health, some in things like, you know, diabetes prevention and what have you. I just think it's interesting that there's a sort of dichotomy and distinction there, which in some ways you could argue is somewhat distorting the market of what we you know, or what we should have. But it does lead us to this very interesting conundrum, right? Which I think is, and I do want to grab you in this conversation, Jeff, which is that we are talking about a place where do we start thinking about prevention? Because if you had birth to death, you know, you were the financier of healthcare from birth to death, which some countries do have that. You can theoretically start thinking about prevention and where is it valuable to do prevention in advance of trying to prevent things like diabetes. If you're getting rid of people when they're aging out of your workforce or out of your health plan, it kind of doesn't matter so much. And I wonder how, Jeff, and maybe it's something for Q&A from the group, how people are thinking about prevention in this landscape, rather than can we like say something on someone who already has a chronic disease in the next 12, 18 months.
No, I mean, Matthew, I think you've, and I don't want to take up too much time from the other panelists, but you've pointed to a real challenge for prevention, which is just who wants to invest and what's the horizon for those outcomes and returns? Because, as you say, if an employer, especially when you're thinking about churn within the workforce, is considering when to make that investment, and the horizon for that payoff comes outside of the time that individual is either employed by that organization, or in the case of an insurer, is no longer a member, and then you've got these real economic thorny questions of, well, why should I invest today for someone I'm not going to reap the benefit of? And then when that individual moves from the commercial space into Medicare or Medicare Advantage, then you've got another crossover question. And so I think one of the challenges for prevention has been demonstrating an early enough outcome vis-a-vis clinical outcomes and cost savings, and also making sure that those cost savings, if they are going to yield return, and there's been a holy question about ROI, when does it show up, and does it maintain and continue? And it actually comes full circle back to a bit of the method, because where I started before, if it's going to be about knowledge and education, and there's a risk that those costs are going to come back, then employers who may be thinking about making that investment with a hope of a near-term return that they can measure and value while that individual is their employee or their member, then that's really challenging if you've got boomeranging costs. But in the sustainable habit change approach, where those values are not only proven and can show up within 12 months, but also grow over time, then there's a higher likelihood that employers and insurers in the near term will make those investments earlier on, that those outcomes will yield benefits for them as opposed to someone else. And that also we can hopefully stem the tide of the number of older adults who are moving into Medicare and Medicare Advantage will have to face these issues. So that's the hope, and that's certainly the bet that we're making here. I'd be really curious to hear what Tom and Brian have to say about it.
So I'd ask Tom and Brian. There's been a lot of conversation about the ROI of these digital health / disease management type interventions for the chronically ill, and we're still, the jury's out on that. Where do you think we are on the sort of the ROI argument for that group versus the ROI argument on the prevention piece?
What was the first part before you said versus?
So the question is ROI on sort of current digital health management programs for people who already have chronic illness versus ROI from a more preventative, looking at a group, more like the pre-diabetes group.
Well, I mean, I think there are many factors that would cause an employer to invest in something on the prevention side, and certainly the ROI is one of those. And the larger employers in particular that that basically own a large actuarial book of risk, they're very carefully. But I've found that there are other dimensions, like, for example, obviously the industry and the turnover within the employee base, which is what we were kind of talking about. But there's also the manner in which that employer views their human capital and workforce. And I mean, there are different philosophies. Some of them look at their human capital as the most important asset, and they want to invest in that. And particularly in areas where there's more competition for talent, you'll see a broader portfolio of benefits, including wellness and prevention. I'm not saying that ROI isn't important. I'm just saying it's not always the only factor. Then the other aspect of this gets into things beyond just the medical actuarial risk and profile. It gets into things like absenteeism, presenteeism, and the broader impact on once again the workforce and productivity and ultimate profitability. And we've seen varying degrees of success of running with those value propositions. But I tend to think that it lines up more with the philosophical bias and the segment of that employer and how they view their workforce as much as it is ROI.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. I would add, in general, what you see across both chronic disease management programs as well as prevention, you are starting to see, I'd say, a separation and maturation of what we've called the digital health space. And a lot of those that are maturing, and that separation is those that have invested the time and energy and creating an evidence base, doing trials and studies to determine how is this intervention equal to or better than other things out there versus those that have not. And that separation is widening as more research kind of comes out, more trials are being done across both chronic disease management as well as prevention.
Brian, do you think that we have enough data showing it's working?
It's early stage. I think we are still building the evidence base on that.
So we are asking our employer friends and others to experiment a little bit. I mean, maybe Tom pointed out that there may be good reasons for doing that. It might be you're keeping. There's been a lot of controversy about Ovia, for example, in the news in the last few days. But some of those expectant mums love it, well,
yep.
But whether or not it's actually saving low birth weight babies and that kind of stuff, who knows?